Imagine walking into your doctor's office, the person in the white coat who has promised to heal you, the one figure in society you can trust without hesitation. You sit down, you tell them your pain, you trust them with your secrets, your life, and even your death certificate. If it comes to that, now imagine that same doctor quietly slipping a lethal dose into your veins, smiling calmly, and telling your family later that you simply passed away of natural causes. This is not a story from fiction, not a chilling thriller novel, but the true story of Harold Shipman, the man history would come to know as Dr. Death. He was not only a family physician in small English towns, but also the most prolific serial killer ever discovered. While most killers are outsiders, shadowy figures, or twisted strangers, Shipman was different. He was inside people's homes, inside their lives, and no one suspected a thing for over 2 decades. His tale is not just about murders, it's about the shattering of trust, about how a man in a respected position used his knowledge and authority to carry out crimes that should have been impossible to hide. He didn't lure his victims with false promises or drag them into dark alleys. Instead, his victims invited him into their lives, welcomed him at their bedside, and believed that his presence meant safety. That blind trust became the perfect mask for death. When you hear the word serial killer, you might imagine someone like Ted Bundy or the Zodiac. Men who killed in the shadows, taunting the police, leaving trails of fear. But Harold Shipman was different. He killed in daylight, in the comfort of living rooms, in quiet hospital wards, and he left behind no trace except what looked like the hand of fate. The deaths piled up slowly, one after another, year after year, until hundreds were gone. No alarms rang, no warnings blared. It was as if death itself was his accomplice. The numbers are staggering. More than 200 lives, maybe even more than 250. Entire generations of families lost their mothers, their grandmothers, their aunts, and all thought it was simply old age, illness, or bad luck. Only later would investigators uncover the horrifying truth. The gentle doctor with the stethoscope had been secretly dealing out death like a god playing with life and time. This story will take you through his journey, from his childhood, where the seeds of his obsession may have been planted, to his rise as a trusted doctor, and finally to his downfall, where arrogance and greed exposed him. But before we step into his past, hold this thought in your mind. The next time you shake hands with someone in authority, someone you trust without question, could they be hiding something far darker? Harold Shipman's story forces us to confront the most unsettling question. If we cannot trust our doctors, then who can we trust at all? Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. He was the second of 4 children, growing up in a working-class family. His father was a lorry driver. His mother, a strict but devoted figure who controlled much of the household. Unlike many infamous killers, Shipman's childhood was not marked by violence, poverty, or crime. He was a quiet, disciplined boy, a gifted student, and often described as polite and well-mannered. Yet, beneath this ordinary exterior, small cracks began to show that hinted at the man he would become. The most profound event of his youth came when he was still a teenager. His mother, whom he adored and shared a close bond with, fell gravely ill with lung cancer. In the 1960s, cancer treatment was far less advanced, and pain management often meant heavy use of morphine. Shipman, still young, witnessed his mother's decline firsthand. Day after day, he sat by her bedside, watching doctors and nurses administer morphine injections. He saw the way the drug brought temporary peace, easing her pain, but also how it pulled her further from life with every dose. By the time she passed away, young Harold had absorbed a lesson far darker than anyone realized. Morphine could not only comfort but also control life and death itself. Her death devastated him, but it also planted a seed. Many psychologists later suggested that this early experience with his mother, this illness, created a twisted connection in his mind between medical authority, morphine, and the quiet, almost invisible power of ending suffering. Where most children would see tragedy, Shipman may have seen possibility. His mother's loss became both his motivation to pursue medicine and the blueprint for his crimes decades later. After her death, Harold threw himself into his studies. He excelled in school, particularly in science, and stood out as intelligent and ambitious. Teachers noticed his drive, though classmates often thought of him as aloof and withdrawn. He was not socially popular but carried himself with confidence, sometimes even arrogance, traits that would later define his professional life. As he grew into adulthood, Shipman carried with him two defining traits: a strong sense of superiority and an obsession with control. He had seen the fragility of life and understood how quickly it could be taken away. Unlike most teenagers, who are shaped by friends, romance, or rebellion, Shipman's defining influence was death itself. When he decided to pursue a career in medicine, it was no surprise to anyone around him. They saw a young man determined to follow a noble path, a boy inspired by his mother's suffering to heal others. But beneath that noble ambition, something darker simmered. The same drug that had eased his mother's pain, morphine, would one day become the very tool he used to kill. The childhood of Harold Shipman shows no monstrous beginning, no violent abuse, no broken home that usually paints the backdrop of serial killers. Instead, it was a seemingly ordinary life with one extraordinary tragedy. And it is perhaps that very ordinariness that makes his later crimes even more chilling. Because if someone so normal, so educated, and so respected could turn into a mass murderer, then what does that say about the faces we trust every day? His mother's death was the spark, and soon the path toward medicine would give him the perfect mask for his darkest desires. After the loss of his mother, Harold Shipman set his sights on medicine with determination. He enrolled at Leeds School of Medicine, one of the respected medical schools in England. As a student, he stood out for his intelligence and discipline, though he carried the same cold, detached demeanor that marked his younger years. He wasn't the most social, often keeping to himself, but he was focused, ambitious, and intent on building a reputation of reliability. His classmates remembered him as serious, perhaps even arrogant, but no one could have guessed that behind his drive lay a far darker ambition. By the early 1970s, Shipman graduated and became a qualified doctor. He took positions in hospitals before eventually working as a general practitioner, the kind of community doctor people would see regularly, sometimes for decades. This was the perfect environment for him. Unlike surgeons or specialists who worked in teams and under constant oversight, a general practitioner often worked in isolation, meeting patients one-on-one, trusted without question. For a man like Shipman, this was not just a career, it was the ideal stage. At first, there were no obvious warning signs. He married a woman named Primrose, and together they built a family with 4 children. To outsiders, he appeared to be the image of respectability, a hard-working doctor, a devoted husband, and a father. But cracks began to form early in his career. Within just a few years of practicing, Shipman developed an addiction to pethidine, a strong painkiller similar to morphine. He started writing fraudulent prescriptions, feeding his own dependency, and eventually was caught. In 1975, he was convicted of forging prescriptions and fined, briefly sent into rehab before being allowed to return to work. This incident could have ended his career, but somehow it didn't. Despite his criminal record, the medical establishment gave him a second chance. He moved to Hyde, a small town near Manchester, and took up work at a general practice there. For many, it seemed like a chance at redemption, a troubled but talented doctor putting his past behind him. But in reality, it was the beginning of something far more sinister. In Hyde, Shipman built a reputation as a reliable, even compassionate doctor. Patients trusted him deeply, especially elderly women, who often relied on him, not just for medical advice, but for comfort and companionship. He cultivated this trust carefully, presenting himself as calm, attentive, and professional. To his colleagues, he sometimes seemed standoffish, but no one suspected he was hiding anything. This was where Harold Shipman perfected the mask he would wear for decades. His patients saw a doctor who listened and cared, but what they didn't see was how he quietly studied them, calculated their conditions, and decided who would live and who would die. His early career had already shown his willingness to manipulate prescriptions and abuse his position. Now, with a loyal patient base and complete professional freedom, he had everything he needed to carry out his deadly ambitions. It is chilling to think that, while many doctors begin their careers driven by a passion to save lives, Shipman may have begun his with a secret passion to control them. The same knowledge that allowed him to heal was the knowledge he would twist to kill. With his white coat and his title, he was untouchable. No one, not his patients, not his colleagues, not even the authorities, realized that Harold Shipman had already started walking the path that would make him the deadliest serial killer in modern history. The mid-1970s marked the time when Harold Shipman may have crossed the invisible line between healer and killer. Though exact records are impossible to verify, investigators later suspected that his first murders took place not long after he returned to practicing medicine in Hyde. These early killings were subtle, hidden beneath the ordinary rhythm of his daily work, but they carried all the hallmarks of what would become his signature method. The typical victim was an elderly woman, often in good enough health that her sudden death seemed unusual but not suspicious enough to trigger alarms. Shipman would visit them, sometimes in their homes, sometimes at the surgery, and quietly administer a lethal dose of diamorphine, the same drug he had seen given to his mother years before. Unlike a violent attack, there was no struggle, no chaos. The patient would drift into unconsciousness, never to wake again. To their families, it looked peaceful. To Shipman, it was complete control, death delivered with the touch of a trusted hand. Why did he begin? Psychologists have speculated endlessly. Was it a twisted attempt to relive his mother's death? To recreate the moment he first saw morphine as both comfort and executioner? Or was it the thrill of playing God, deciding who should live and who should die? Perhaps it was both. What's clear is that once Shipman discovered how easy it was to kill without suspicion, he never stopped. These early victims never received justice, not even recognition, until decades later. Their deaths were certified as natural, with Shipman himself often signing the paperwork. He wrote their medical notes, recording false symptoms or exaggerating existing illnesses to make the death seem inevitable. With a few strokes of a pen, he erased any trace of crime. He was the doctor, the authority, and no one dared question him. What made these first murders even more insidious was the way they blended seamlessly into the role everyone expected him to play. Patients trusted him with their secrets, their fears, and their lives. Families looked at him with gratitude when he explained what had happened, and while they grieved, Shipman moved on to his next patient, his next opportunity. He had discovered a perfect system, a weapon that was legal, a cover story that was unquestionable, and a setting that made him invisible. It is impossible to pinpoint exactly who the first victim was. Some investigators suggested it could have been as early as 1975, around the same time as his conviction for prescription fraud, while others believed it began in earnest when he settled in Hyde in the late 1970s. What matters is that by the end of that decade, Harold Shipman had already become something far worse than a corrupt doctor. He was a predator disguised as a caretaker, using his position not only to hide his crimes, but to make them look like acts of mercy. Looking back, these first murders reveal the blueprint of everything to come. A trusted doctor, a vulnerable patient, a lethal dose of diamorphine, and a death that seemed to arrive naturally. No police investigation, no outcry, no suspicion. Just another doctor's visit ending in tragedy that no one thought to question. It was a perfect storm of opportunity and arrogance, and it marked the birth of one of the most prolific killers the world would ever know. For Shipman, the experiment was complete. He had found a way to kill without consequence. And soon, the quiet deaths would multiply into the hundreds. Once Harold Shipman realized how easily he could kill without suspicion, the deaths began to fall into a chilling rhythm. His victims were most often elderly women. Though men were not entirely excluded, they were patients who trusted him, who called on him when they were sick, or who welcomed him into their homes for routine visits. To them, he was the kind, reliable family doctor who would sit and listen, who seemed to care. But beneath the surface, Shipman was calculating, deciding silently who would not live to see another day. The method rarely changed. He would arrive for a home visit or see the patient in his surgery. Then, with calm precision, he would administer a lethal injection of diamorphine. Sometimes he would speak gently as they slipped away. Sometimes he would simply sit and watch. The entire act was over within minutes, the victim's life extinguished without struggle. Shipman would then take the final step in his deadly ritual. Paperwork. He would record false symptoms, exaggerate minor conditions, and finally sign the death certificate himself. His authority as a doctor meant no one questioned his word. To families, it looked like fate. To Shipman, it was power. He repeated this process again and again, year after year. Estimates suggest he was killing roughly 10 to 15 patients annually, though the number likely varied. Some years, he may have taken more. Each death seemed ordinary, blending into the natural mortality of elderly patients. It was the perfect camouflage. Unlike violent killers who risked police attention after every crime, Shipman hid in plain sight, his actions invisible against the background of everyday medicine. What stands out most in this pattern is how utterly ordinary the deaths appeared. No weapons, no blood, no scenes of horror. Just patients who seemed to slip away in their homes, sometimes sitting in chairs, sometimes lying in bed, often still dressed in their day clothes as if they had been in conversation only moments earlier. Families grieved, but none suspected murder. Many even thanked Shipman for being present during their loved ones' final moments, not realizing he was the reason those moments came so soon. The trust people placed in him became his greatest weapon. Unlike other killers who must stalk, deceive, or lure, Shipman's victims invited him in. They sought his advice, followed his instructions, and never once considered that he might betray them. His reputation in Hyde was one of professionalism and dedication. Patients recommended him to friends, families relied on him across generations, and colleagues saw him as aloof but competent. That aura of trust made questioning him unthinkable. As the years passed, the deaths mounted quietly. Dozens became scores. Scores became hundreds. Each one was noted in the records as a natural end, yet each one was in truth a calculated act. This steady rhythm of murder created the foundation for his later exposure, because while the pattern hid him for years, it also left behind something that careful eyes would eventually notice. Numbers that didn't add up. For now, though, Shipman remained untouchable. He had perfected a system of murder that blended seamlessly into the daily life of a doctor. Every visit could be deadly, every injection a final one, and yet he carried on with calm confidence, certain that no one would ever suspect the kindly family physician of being a serial killer. This was not a spree, not an impulsive string of crimes, but a cold, deliberate pattern, a ritual of trust, betrayal, and silence that would continue for more than 2 decades. Kathleen Grundy's case would become the most infamous of Harold Shipman's murders, but it was only one of many. Grundy, a wealthy and well-respected former mayor of Hyde, was in good health for her age. When she was found dead at home in 1998, it appeared to be natural. Shipman had visited her that very morning, and as usual, he signed her death certificate himself. But suspicions arose almost immediately when her daughter, Angela Woodruff, received news of her mother's will. It left nearly her entire estate, worth over £300,000, to Harold Shipman. Angela, a solicitor by profession, knew her mother would never have done such a thing. She alerted authorities, and that decision would begin to unravel the full scope of Shipman's crimes. Grundy's body was exhumed, and toxicology reports showed lethal levels of diamorphine, the very drug Shipman had seen used on his mother decades earlier. But Grundy was far from his only victim. In fact, what investigators discovered was a chilling pattern across decades of practice. The majority of Shipman's victims were elderly women who trusted him implicitly. He would visit them at home, often under the guise of a routine checkup, and administer a fatal dose of diamorphine. Most died quickly. Their families told it was simply a natural passing due to age or illness. Shipman's word carried weight. He was their doctor, their confidant, someone they had no reason to question. Families would often thank him for being present in their loved ones' final moments, not knowing he was the reason those moments came so soon. Another case that stood out during inquiries was that of 93-year-old Nora. She was described as active and sharp for her age, yet she died suddenly after a home visit from Shipman. When her family expressed mild surprise, Shipman brushed it off, saying her heart had simply given out. He reassured them with such calm confidence that no one pushed further. In reality, she too had been injected with diamorphine. The brutality of Shipman's methods was in their simplicity. He didn't use elaborate schemes or violent attacks. Instead, his murders were quiet, almost invisible, disguised as medical care. The trust people had in him was his weapon. That trust allowed him to not only kill, but to continue killing, year after year, largely undetected. What made Kathleen Grundy's murder particularly striking, aside from the forged will, was that she was not sick or frail. She was healthy, active, and had been planning her future. Her death should have raised red flags instantly, yet only Shipman's brazen attempt at financial gain exposed the truth. This greed separated her case from the countless others who had slipped into the ground with no questions asked. Investigations later suggested that Shipman may have killed as many as 250 patients. That number made him not only Britain's most prolific serial killer, but one of the deadliest in recorded history. Each victim's story was a tragedy of ordinary people who believed they were safe under the care of a trusted doctor. But for Shipman, they became little more than names on his list, signatures on death certificates, and lives quietly erased without struggle. Kathleen Grundy's case cracked open the facade. Her deaths exposed Shipman's arrogance, his willingness to go beyond silent murder into outright fraud, and it provided investigators with the evidence they needed to finally stop him. Yet behind her story were hundreds more, families who had buried their loved ones, never suspecting that the very man who stood by them in their grief had orchestrated it all. For years, Harold Shipman's ability to conceal his crimes depended on one simple truth. People trusted their doctor. That trust gave him extraordinary power, and he used it with meticulous calculation. Each time a patient died, Shipman would personally handle the paperwork. He would sign the death certificate, record a natural cause, and reassure grieving families that their loved one's passing was peaceful and inevitable. His calm, authoritative tone left little room for doubt. Families accepted his word, funeral directors followed his guidance, and colleagues rarely questioned his decisions. In the medical world, Shipman's authority made him nearly untouchable. One of his most effective tools was his manipulation of medical records. Before or after a killing, he would alter notes to suggest that the patient had been ill or in decline. If a sudden death occurred, the records backed up his story. To an outside observer, it looked consistent. An elderly patient with worsening health simply passed away. In reality, Shipman was crafting an alibi on paper, using his access to files and his position as a trusted general practitioner. The sheer volume of death certificates he signed also went unnoticed for a long time. Colleagues occasionally remarked on the unusually high number of patients dying under his care, but no one pushed hard enough. Part of the cover came from the demographics of his victims. Many were elderly women, and sudden deaths in that group did not raise immediate alarm. Shipman exploited this fact ruthlessly, choosing victims who would not spark intense investigation. He also kept families close, attending funerals, offering condolences, and presenting himself as a compassionate physician. By standing at their side during grief, he masked the reality that he had caused it. For undertakers, his presence became routine. For neighbors, he was a respected figure who always seemed to be around when tragedy struck. The consistency of his involvement ironically normalized suspicion away. Shipman's addiction to control played a role in his cover-ups as well. Unlike many killers, he did not dispose of bodies secretly. He allowed victims to be buried or cremated through standard processes, confident his paperwork would shield him. By signing off causes of death as strokes, heart attacks, or old age, he erased questions before they could form. On the rare occasions when doubts surfaced, his reputation as a reliable doctor was strong enough to silence them. This strategy worked for over 2 decades. Hundreds of deaths passed without challenge, each one wrapped neatly in official documents. Even when some colleagues raised concerns about the unusual patterns, initial police inquiries failed to gather enough evidence. Shipman's manipulation of records made it seem as though nothing was amiss. His crimes were hidden in plain sight, protected not by elaborate schemes, but by the natural trust society places in medical professionals. What made his cover-up particularly chilling was its simplicity. There was no grand conspiracy, no complex web of accomplices. It was one man exploiting a position of authority, turning bureaucracy and trust into weapons. The system, designed to care for and protect patients, became his perfect camouflage. Each forged note, each signed certificate, each carefully chosen word at a funeral extended his freedom. For decades, Harold Shipman lived as both healer and executioner, his crimes buried under the very structures meant to prevent them. By the time Kathleen Grundy's case exposed him, Shipman had spent years perfecting this. He had grown so confident in his ability to cover his tracks that he pushed further, forging wills and manipulating financial documents. That arrogance would ultimately break the cycle, but until then, his cover-up was almost flawless, allowing him to become the most prolific serial killer in modern history while hiding in plain sight. The downfall of Harold Shipman began not with police surveillance or forensic breakthroughs, but with the suspicions of ordinary people. Local undertakers in Hyde, who dealt with many of the deaths certified by Shipman, noticed a troubling pattern. Too many of his patients were dying suddenly, often sitting fully dressed in chairs rather than in bed. Doctors in nearby practices also began to whisper about the unusually high death rate connected to his name. Yet despite these concerns, early inquiries went nowhere. In 1998, police launched a small investigation but failed to uncover enough evidence, largely because Shipman's medical authority and forged records made the deaths appear natural. For the moment, he remained untouchable. That changed with the death of Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy, active, and seemingly healthy 81-year-old. Grundy was found dead in her home shortly after a visit from Shipman. He signed her death certificate, listing old age as the cause. But days later, her daughter Angela Woodruff received a shocking will. It left nearly all of Grundy's estate to Harold Shipman, cutting out her family entirely. Angela, herself a solicitor, immediately recognized the document as a forgery. She contacted the police. And this time, the authorities took the case seriously. Investigators exhumed Grundy's body, and toxicology tests revealed high levels of diamorphine, a variant drug Shipman had used countless times before. This was the first undeniable proof that her death was not natural. The forged will and financial motive added another layer of damning evidence. Detectives began combing through Shipman's patient records, uncovering alterations that matched the deaths of other elderly women. The consistency was chilling. Healthy patients dying suddenly, Shipman present at the time, and medical notes rewritten to suggest long-term illness. As police dug deeper, they built a profile of a doctor who had been killing for decades. They realized Grundy was only the tip of the iceberg. By cross-referencing death certificates, medical histories, and testimonies from families, they began to see the vast scale of his crimes. In September 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested. Officers searched his home and found not only the forged documents, but also evidence of his tampering with medical records. The arrest stunned the community. Patients who had once trusted him were forced to question the deaths of their loved ones. Families who had accepted his word were confronted with the possibility that those words had been lies designed to cover murder. What had seemed like natural deaths were now revealed as deliberate killings. Shipman's calm/reassuring presence had hidden a monstrous reality, and with Kathleen Grundy's case, the mask finally slipped. The capture of Harold Shipman marked the end of his reign as the Dr. Death of Hyde. But it also opened the door to one of the largest murder investigations in British history. Detectives now faced the grim task of uncovering just how many lives he had taken under the cover of care. Harold Shipman's trial began in October 1999 at Preston Crown Court, drawing nationwide attention. The charges were focused on 15 murders, along with forgery related to the Kathleen Grundy will. The courtroom was packed with journalists, families of victims, and a public desperate to understand how a trusted doctor could secretly be a mass murderer. The prosecution laid out a case that was both straightforward and devastating. Each charge followed the same pattern: an elderly patient, a sudden unexplained death, Shipman present at the time, and medical records later found to be altered. The cornerstone of the case was Kathleen Grundy. Her forged will showed clear motive, and her exhumed body provided undeniable proof of lethal diamorphine poisoning. This evidence was reinforced by testimony from her daughter, Angela Woodruff, whose persistence had forced the investigation forward. Prosecutors argued that Shipman had grown arrogant, believing himself beyond suspicion, and in his greed, had made the mistakes that finally exposed him. Family members of other victims also took the stand. They described Shipman's visits, the sudden deaths, and his calm reassurances that their loved ones had simply passed from natural causes. One by one, these stories painted a picture of a man who had preyed upon the most vulnerable while presenting himself as their guardian. Medical experts testified about the toxicology reports, the excessive prescribing of diamorphine, and the irregularities in his patient notes. Throughout the trial, Shipman maintained a cold, emotionless demeanor. He denied all charges, insisting that the deaths were natural and that the records reflected genuine medical judgment. His lack of remorse, combined with his refusal to admit guilt, only hardened public opinion against him. To the families watching in court, his calmness felt like indifference to the suffering he had caused. After months of testimony, the jury reached their verdict in January 2000. Shipman was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. The judge handed down a life sentence with the rare recommendation that he'd never be released a whole life tariff. The conviction sent shockwaves through the medical community and the public at large. If a trusted family doctor could secretly kill his patients for years, what did that mean for the safety of others? Yet even as justice was delivered for the 15 confirmed murders, questions remained. A public inquiry was launched to examine Shipman's entire career. The results were staggering. Evidence suggested he had killed at least 215 patients, with suspicions that the true number might be closer to 250. This made him not only the most prolific serial killer in British history, but one of the deadliest in the world. The trial may have closed one chapter, but it opened a much larger reckoning with the failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked for decades. After his conviction, Harold Shipman was sent to serve his life sentence at Wakefield Prison, one of the highest security facilities in Britain. Isolated from the outside world and despised by both inmates and guards, he maintained the same cold silence he had shown throughout his trial. He never admitted to his crimes, never expressed remorse, and never offered answers to the families of his victims. For many, this refusal to speak denied them the closure they desperately sought. Shipman simply continued to live as though the horrors of his past were not his responsibility. In prison, Shipman's behavior remained unsettling. He kept to himself, avoided contact, and gave little insight into his motives. Psychologists speculated endlessly. Was he driven by power, by a compulsion to kill, or by some twisted desire to relive his mother's death? The truth died with him, because Harold Shipman never explained his actions. The mystery of why haunted both investigators and families alike. On January 13, 2004, one day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found dead in his cell. He had hanged himself, with bedsheets tied to the bars of his window. His suicide shocked the nation once again. For some families, it robbed them of any chance of answers, leaving the question of motive forever unresolved. For others, it was a grim relief that the man who had caused so much pain would no longer draw breath. The aftermath of his death did not erase his legacy. Instead, it forced sweeping changes in British medicine and law. The Shipman inquiry, which had already been underway, concluded that he had murdered at least 215 patients, with suspicions of dozens more. In response, the government introduced stricter systems for monitoring controlled drugs, new safeguards for death certification, and reforms to how doctors are supervised. The trust that Shipman had so deeply betrayed could never be fully repaired, but measures were taken to ensure no single doctor could wield such unchecked power again. Today, Harold Shipman is remembered not as a healer, but as the most prolific serial killer in modern British history. His story is a chilling reminder of the dangers of blind trust, and of how evil can hide in plain sight, cloaked in respectability. In the end, the man once called Dr. Death left behind a trail of hundreds of silent graves, a community scarred by betrayal, and a warning that resonates far beyond the small town of Hyde.